My name is Clarence White. I'm the Associate Director here at the Eastside Freedom Library. I have that privilege of working with several of the people who are here. In addition to thanking everyone for attending, I want to thank Subtext Books. So for the folks who are here, there are books for sale at the back table. So we're grateful for that relationship and partnership with Subtext. Also, anyone watching virtually, you can either walk into Subtext or order online copies of the book, well, books plural, that we'll be talking about today. I'm very happy to introduce this event. Thank you for all being here, but especially thank you to Bill Fletcher for joining us for this event. I'm learning more about you since you walked through the door, and just looking forward to a great evening. So, again, thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Clarence. I just want to introduce my old friend, Bill Fletcher. If you're not already familiar with him and his work, it's just really a staggering resume that we try to talk about the importance of intersectionality here at the Eastside Freedom Library and how labor struggles, community struggles, struggles for racial justice, struggles for gender justice are interwoven together. Bill's life has really been a testament to that. Bill was president of the Trans-Africa Forum, succeeding Randall Robinson, who really put the issue of reparations and the debt on our agendas still. Bill has worked for UAW District 65, the National Postal Mail Handlers Union, SEIU. For a little more than a hot minute, he was Director of Education for the National AFL-CIO, worked for the American Federation of Government Employees, now has an affiliation with the Zinn Education Project, was a senior scholar at the Institute for Policy Studies. His previous books, before he started to write fiction, co-wrote a book with Peter Agard, The Indispensable Ally, Black Workers and the Formation of the CIO, wrote a book, co-wrote with Fernando Gapasan, Solidarity Divided, The Crisis in Organized Labor and a New Path Towards Social Justice, and more recently a book, They're Bankrupting Us and 20 Other Myths About Unions. It's been very exciting for me at this stage in my life to see that Bill has turned towards writing fiction. Don't worry, I'm not going to be writing any fiction, but I have absolutely gobbled up Bill's two most recent books that he's going to be talking with us about tonight, and hopefully telling us about the potentialities of fiction as a way to raise consciousness and connect with folks. So, Bill Fletcher, we're all yours.
Oh, well, thank you, Peter. Thank you.
Yeah.
It's a real pleasure and an honor to be here. And I love having this kind of discussion, and I'll be looking forward to questions and comments that you all have. I want to, authors are always supposed to read something that they wrote. So I'm going to read a little bit. I had a lot of fun writing this. This is a sequel to the first book, The Man Who Fell from the Sky. And I will, when we get into it, I'll explain how I got into fiction. But I will tell you in advance that from when I was a kid, I dreamed up stories. And I would dream up all kinds of stories, war stories, this or that or whatever, and wanted to write them. And when I became radicalized, I became radicalized when I was 13, but I became active when I was 15. And from that point on, I focused on nonfiction things, the commentaries, or strategy, or whatever else. And always still wanted to do fiction, not as opposed to nonfiction, because I've had people that have freaked out. They said, Bill, are you ever going to write nonfiction again? And I said, well, why can't I do both, you know? But there is something I will get into when we talk in a second, and I want to read this, that what I've discovered in writing is that writing is a two-lane highway. And if you change lanes, you get a ticket. So you're either in the fiction or the nonfiction lane. And when you stray over, publishers and readers are often very unforgiving. And it's very hard to make a breakthrough when you've gone there. And it's both ways. So you have great fiction writers who try entering to nonfiction, and it just doesn't connect. You have great nonfiction writers. Like, how many of you knew that W.E.B. Du Bois wrote a novel? Okay, so most people don't. I mean, this is, and from what I understand, it was a good novel, but you don't think of Du Bois as a novel writer because he's not allowed to change lanes. And I decided, in part because I'm very mischievous, that I was just I'm going to drive the car on both sides, you know? So this book starts with the discovery of some bones in the year 2004. And then it goes back to the year 1978 in the Quincy shipyard in Massachusetts, which is, by coincidence, where I worked. And in the summer of 1978, I fell 20 feet. And this book takes place a week after I fell. This is a book of fiction, so while there was a Quincy shipyard, of course I must say, this is not the same one. There was a shipbuilders union, of course this isn't the same one. You get the picture. But I decided I wanted the readers to understand something about shipyards. So this starts in that summer. Alberto Pires returned to his position on the starboard side of the liquefied natural gas tanker under construction. Already covered in sweat, he had just taken his 9 a.m. break. It was one of those Massachusetts summer days where the heat and the humidity were off the charts, even this early in the morning. Like most welders in the shipyard, Pires had gotten used to the heat and humidity, hated it, but gotten used to it. Pires climbed through the partially completed hatch to enter the compartment where he and his partner, Alice Love, had been working. Looking around, he realized that he was alone, Alice gone on break. Slowly, he climbed up the ladder 15 feet to get to his position on the wooden planks resting on metal stiffeners. He sat on the upturned can he used while welding or when taking a break. Pires took a quick look at Alice's position and the can on which she had been sitting. Her electric arc welding line, holder, and shield were lying next to her can. Damn, he hated working with women, even women as gorgeous as Alice. The shipyard was no place for them, and he could not believe, at least until he met Alice, that women could make good welders. But sure enough, she was not just good, she was great. Even with half the men in the shipyard hitting on her, she ignored them and kept working. Maybe she was uma lesbica. He did not know. Pires felt his undershirt clinging to his soaked body. He hated this work, but at least he had a job. When Pires arrived in Massachusetts from Portugal, the welding job was the only work he could find. It did not help to remember that once he had been a big man, an important man. But wasn't that the story for so many immigrants? Pires pulled his mask over his mouth and nose, making sure to cover his mustache and short beard to protect them from the fumes and dirt. He refitted the earplugs, muffling the sounds around him, and donned his helmet. The hammering and drilling had picked up in tempo as more of the workers returned from morning break. The smell from the welding wasn't too bad in his compartment because there was only the two of them, and there was a blower making a sound like a persistent moaning, constantly pushing the smoke out of their hole. He stood up, attached a welding rod to the holder, and locked it in position, then pulled the shield down, closing the visor and looking through the darkened lens. In the darkness, he struck an arc, watching it glowing golden, creating what looked like lava. The lava turned into a welding bead, which he laid horizontally across the top of the compartment. He heard a noise below, not stopping the check, but assuming that Alice was returning to her position. He felt the vibration of someone climbing the ladder, and then heard someone, probably Alice, climbing up to their position. He kept welding, focusing on the bead and the golden molten metal being put into place. With the welding rod burned down to about an inch, Perez stopped, lifted his shield, and disconnected the remnant of the rod from the holder, throwing the remnant down. He turned around expecting to see Alice, but there was no one there. Curious, Perez, standing nearly 6 feet tall, rose and walked over to the ladder, situated against the planks. He leaned over to take a look, but lost his balance and fell forward. Suddenly, everything went black. So this is a murder mystery. I'm not giving away much to say it wasn't an accident. But the main character of the story is a guy named David Gomes. He was the main character in the first book, The Man Who Fell from the Sky. And he is a Cape Verdean American. He is a journalist in Hyannis, Massachusetts on Cape Cod in a small liberal to progressive paper. And he gets asked by a doctor who's affiliated with something called the Massachusetts Committee or Coalition on Occupational Safety and Health, which is a real group. And he's asked by her to write a story about why shipyards were, at that time, the second most dangerous industry in the country after mining. And so, reluctantly, he decides to go forward and do that. And in the process, there are some curious things that start to occur to him about this death. And he then slowly begins to suspect that this was not an accident. But then the question is, if it wasn't an accident, what was it? And why would someone have whacked this guy Perez? I'll read another section from it in a minute, but I wanted to stop there.
So for the benefit of our audience, both in person and remotely, many of us Minnesotans have never met a Cape Verdean.
Right.
And I wonder if you would just tell us a little bit about
Absolutely.
the Cape Verdeans and also why you've chosen to write about Cape Verdeans.
So most people in the United States have never met a Cape Verdean. You ask them, do you know anything about Cape Verdeans? And they'll say, yeah, right? And it's one of those, yeah, when you know they have no idea what you're talking about, right? So 500 miles or so off the coast of West Africa is the Cape Verde archipelago. And it was settled by the Portuguese in the 1500s and used as a transit point for the slave trade out of Africa to the Western Hemisphere. And in the course of that, there were people that were brought there that settled, and a population developed. The Portuguese, let's say nicely, intermingled with the Africans, and as a result, you ended up having people of different complexions, some very dark, some as light as me, some lighter. And on different islands in the archipelago, there is, or some people pronounce it archipelago, there are islands that are darker and others that are lighter and some mixtures. This was a Portuguese colony until 1975. In the 19th century, the first post-1492 non-slave Africans came to the Western Hemisphere, and they came from Cape Verde. And they came as fishermen and whalers, right, because these ships would come through the Cape Verde, and they'd stop to get food and water and other things and sail off. And then they went to what was one of the most important sailing ports in the country, which was New Bedford, and in southeastern Massachusetts. And people started to settle there, and then they started bringing their families. The Cape Verde Islands are subject to droughts, and serious droughts, not like for a few months, but they can be for years. And that plays itself out into the culture of Cape Verde. And so you'll have certain kinds of music that basically translates into like mourning. And people will migrate off of the islands because of the drought conditions. And there's great sadness about people leaving and whether they'll ever return, et cetera. So Cape Verdeans started settling in southeastern Massachusetts and then going up through, from Providence up through Boston. And then in time, moving to other places like New York and then, interestingly, Los Angeles and San Francisco Bay Area. Cape Verde, the Cape Verde racial experience is very different from non-Cape Verdean African Americans. So for me, Peter, I first encountered Cape Verdeans in the 1960s as a kid. I grew up in New York, and I grew up in very mixed areas in Harlem around African Americans, either of Caribbean descent or from the US South, and Puerto Ricans. We moved to the Bronx, and it was Puerto Ricans, African Americans, Caribbeans, Poles, Jews, Italians, Chinese, you got it, the whole thing. We would vacation often in Cape Cod, where, as I like to say, I encountered black people with strange names. And it's like, this sounds Spanish, but it's not, you don't sound Spanish. But they'd have names like Gomes, Daluz, Fonseca, and other names, Perez. And I couldn't quite figure them out. And then there were these identity issues that emerged. And so many of them would not identify as black at the time. The terms were Negro, colored, Afro-American, and then later black. And sometimes, you know, it's like, no, I'm Portuguese. I knew something about Portugal. And I'm saying, you don't exactly look Portuguese, right? and so couldn't quite figure this out. And then over time, as I got older, well, and then I said, well, maybe it's just that they're not from New York, right? And I'm a New York chauvinist, right? And so, no, that wasn't it. And then over time, I started learning about Cape Verdeans. And one of the things was that white supremacy played itself out differently in the Portuguese colonies than it did where the Brits settled. And differently with the Portuguese and the Spanish had very similar method of imposing colonialism and white supremacy. And that was largely because capitalism was not as developed in Spain and Portugal. So when the Spanish and the Portuguese come to the Western Hemisphere, they don't mainly send settlers. They send conquistadors. They send all these folks to grab and rape the land and the people. And whereas the Brits had more advanced capitalism and had all of these poor people as a result of the enclosures and the removing of people from the land. And so they started sending people to Ireland, thus you have a settler state in Ireland, and then to the North America. And so the Spanish and the Portuguese start intermixing with the indigenous and then with the Africans that they bring over. And so you get these different layers of populations based on shades of color and who intermixed with whom. And the Spanish developed what they called Las Castas, which if you never heard about it, when you go home, you gotta look it up because Hitler couldn't have invented something like this. It was brilliant. It was a designation for virtually every intermixing you could imagine. At the bottom of this racial pyramid were the Africans and the indigenous, and one or the other would be at the bottom, depending on the country. And then you go up the pyramid, and then it's different mixing. And at the top would be the Europeans, and right beneath them would be the Creoles, who were the Europeans, but not from Europe. That is, their ancestors had been from Europe, and they weren't mixed with anybody. This is different from Louisiana Creoles. And then beneath them, all kinds of other mixings. All right, so the Cape Verdeans come with this experience. And what do they discover here? They discover these people of African descent who were the descendants of slaves. The Cape Verdeans were not. They were mainly Protestants, spoke English, and where the British had instituted and white Americans furthered the one-drop rule. So that, and I joke with people in Latin America, when I go to Latin America, and people will ask me, they'll say, Bill, well, what are you? I say, I'm black. And they'll say, no. And I said, no, I'm black. And they'd say, no, you're like a mulatto, you're this and that. I'm black. And then I turn it into a joke and I say, see, here's the deal. When I'm in Latin America, you can't figure out what I am. If I land in New York and I say I'm anything other than black, they'll put me in a straitjacket and take me to an insane asylum. I said, so why is that? And that opens up these amazing discussions about the way white supremacy played itself out. So the Cape Verdeans come here and they don't know really what to do with us, and we didn't know really what to do with them. And it's sort of like if anyone ever drove a manual transmission car and you push the clutch in and you shift gears, but you don't push the clutch in at exactly the right time, you hear the right? That was the relationship between Cape Verdeans and non-Cape Verdean African Americans. It was complicated until you got into gear. So some Cape Verdeans immediately identified as black, or whatever the term was at the time, and played major roles, like in setting up NAACP chapters, et cetera. Great musicians like Horace Silver. But others would not. And I found this fascinating, Peter. So I decided, let's do a murder mystery where we talk about race, but we talk about it in non-traditional ways, because we're so used to this sort of black-white binary here in the United States. I wanted to just, in part because I'm mischievous, I wanted to just complicate it and just say, race is more complicated because race is not about science, it's about social control. So let's look at the way that it plays itself out. So that's what I did.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So, oh, please, yes.
What's the name of your book?
The first book was The Man Who Fell from the Sky, and this book is The Man Who Changed Colors. And this has a double meaning, which of course I'm not going to tell you. And the first one, I can't explain the name, why I came up with that either, without giving you away the story. So, but this has, I decided to have a double meaning.
And the second question is, when you decided to write fiction, why crime fiction?
Because I was always inspired by film noir, and then by the work of people like Walter Mosley. I love Easy Rollins, but I really was into film noir, a real Bogart fan, right? And Robert Mitchum, and I mean, I love film noir. If you ever, how many of you are Perry Mason fans? The original Perry Mason. All right, now, if you watch the original Perry Mason show, right, you gotta watch the very first episodes. They are different than the later episodes. They're much more film noirish. And it's real, I didn't realize this, and I'm watching, I said, wow. I said to my wife, this is a different Perry Mason. And that really inspired me. But I also wrote this because a lot of leftists have done fiction, crime fiction. And you can introduce a lot of good political themes through crime fiction. And that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to, like, there's a part of me that has this creative side, but I wanted to talk politics, but in a different way. And I also wanted to praise a population that people don't pay attention to, don't know. And I think that the Cape Verdean population is a remarkable population and a really interesting population, and they don't get credit for who they are, and they don't really get encouraged to be Cape Verdean. I was talking to a friend of mine, a Cape Verdean friend of mine, who was talking about how among many younger Cape Verdeans, they've stopped identifying as Cape Verdean, which is a very peculiar thing, right? Because like in the 60s, people would say, I'm Portuguese, and then maybe reluctantly they'd say they were Cape Verdean. And now you're saying, you know, Bill, a lot of younger people are saying either they're Latino or Latina, or they're African American, and ignoring the Cape Verdean side. And so part of what I wanted to do was say, no, this is like a really legitimate part of the Black experience. So.
Let me ask,
Yeah.
connected to that, that you also have Portuguese characters.
Yes.
And the historical conflict between Portuguese and Cape Verdeans plays a role in this novel.
It does.
And so how does that colonialism, anti-colonialism, also play a role in this domestic story?
So there are Portuguese fascists in this book. And this book takes place in 1978. The first book takes place 1970, 1971. So by 1978, Guinea-Bissau, Cape Verde, Angola, Mozambique are all liberated. And Portugal went through a revolution in April 1974. So I decided I wanted to situate it in 78 precisely for that reason, that the situation is complicated in a different way. In the first book, I'm also trying to deal with Cape Verdean transition and consciousness. In 78, that's much less the case. The part of what colonial mentality doesn't evaporate when independence happens. And colonial mentality continues to play itself out. And so there's still this way, like among other things, Portuguese would look down on Cape Verdeans. But there's also a way that many Cape Verdeans still clung to a kind of Portuguese identity. And there were obviously Cape Verdeans and Angolans and Mozambicans who fought on the side of the Portuguese. You know, this is one of the things. This is going to sound like a tangent, so forgive me. In the United States, we all too often fall into progressive demographic politics. That is, we look at demographic groups and identify them as, well, they're basically progressive or whatever else. And we downplay that within demographic groups, there's all kinds of politics that are at play. If you look at South Africa, for instance, it's not like everybody was on the side of the ANC and the PAC. I mean, there were large numbers of Black people that were on the side of the apartheid government. Now, they may not want to acknowledge it now, but they were. There were people that were on the side of the Portuguese. And they come to the United States, and they bring that with them. And they bring those politics with them, which makes it very complicated. So you're looking at someone, and you may think because of where they're from and their shade of color or whatever, that they may be almost instinctively progressive. And then you're in for a rude awakening. So that's what I did.
So one of the things that I loved about both books is your attention to work and what goes on in workplaces. And not just the shipyard, but also the newspaper office and the dynamics among the workers there. But I didn't see a lot about the labor movement.
Right.
There are references in this book to the shipyard union and whether the union is strong or weak or what role it plays. But given how much of your life you've spent in the labor movement, why isn't there more about the labor movement in these books?
Well, in the first book, because I wanted to tell a story that was rooted in something that happened in World War II. And that was my prime objective, as well as to talk about who this population called Cape Verdeans were. In the second book, I look at it differently, Peter. I rooted the book in the shipyard and in the experience of working in the shipyard and in the problems of dealing with a very backward local. That in the face of the death of a welder who was Cape Verdean, to a great extent the leadership couldn't care less. And that, to a great extent, summarized the union that I was a part of. So this is a glimpse, but the book is not about the labor movement. The book is about Cape Verdeans, but it's mainly about race, justice, and revenge. I've always been interested in the line between justice and revenge, and I wanted to play that out, and I didn't want to answer the question in either book for the reader. I want the reader in both books to walk away and decide what they think. It'd be much too easy, and it'd be very arrogant, frankly, right? Otherwise, so that's what I was really interested in doing. So I felt, and maybe I didn't do it enough, but I felt like in situating it within the shipyard and with this I wanted the readers to understand what was for me my second education. So I went to Harvard, graduated from Harvard, and ultimately went to work as a welder in a shipyard because I wanted to get involved in the labor movement. My father was furious. He said, "We sent you to Harvard and you're doing what?" My mother's point of view was, the boy graduated cum laude, leave him alone, right? But my father he could never get over that, right? But when you go to an Ivy League school, you go to a place that trains you to run the world. That's the purpose of the Ivy Leagues. And even when you're a leftist, as I was entering into Harvard and leaving Harvard, excuse me, you're contaminated by arrogance. And you are. And you leave there thinking, well, there will be a socialist revolution, and of course I will lead it, right?
Right.
And why? Because I know more, right? And so I'm only slightly exaggerating, folks. So I get to the shipyard, and I didn't know how to weld. I went through a training program there. They obviously didn't know I went to Harvard. And then I had to learn the real way, which was from other workers. And they basically taught me how to be a welder and how to survive for nearly 4 years there, even after falling. And that was a humbling experience. I wanted the readers to get a sense of that. It was a humbling experience. My great-grandmother, who was alive for part of the time I was working there, was crying because I was working at the shipyard. And it was, I couldn't explain to her why I was doing it. I didn't think she would get it. I mean, she was the widow of this great pre-Harlem Renaissance poet, anthologist, author, mentor of many Harlem Renaissance people, named William Stanley Braithwaite, who had always wanted me to go to Harvard, bought me my first comic book. I didn't go to Harvard because of him, at least I didn't think so at the time. And, but she just could, you know what I mean? But I don't regret it. I mean, it made me a better trade union. It taught me to be a trade unionist, a leftist trade unionist. And part of what it also did, see, I didn't go there. What many younger people enter the trade union movement, and they have illusions. And as a friend of mine once said to me, in order to be disillusioned, you first have to have illusions. And I didn't go into the labor movement thinking it was a panacea. My parents didn't raise me that way. They were both trade unionists. I went in thinking this is going to be complicated, and it sure as hell was. But I'm still with the movement.
Do you want to read a little more for us, Bill?
Yeah, let me read another
Please,
part.
please.
Before I do, I saw a hand over there.
Ah.
You there?
I was told to hold the questions, so go ahead.
Okay. All right.
She's in charge.
Good, good. So David Gomes suspects murder. And a leader of this rank and file caucus at the shipyard puts him in touch with this Irish immigrant who works in the shipyard and who knows something about this right-wing group, white supremacists that are in the shipyard. And so the guy's trying to figure out, David Gomes is going to talk to the guy because he wants to try to find out what he can about this white supremacist group. Dairy by the Sea was a club across from Quincy Bay near Wollaston Beach. There were not many establishments there, though during the warmer months there were a few food stands for people at the beach. Gomes drove into the club's parking lot at 4:05 p.m. Gomes opened the wooden door and walked in. The club had a wide window looking out on Quincy Shore Drive and the beach, providing a lot of natural light and a view of the sea. When Gomes took a look around, it was clear why Agnes was not worried about O'Hare finding him. There was not one other person in the bar with any degree of African, Asian, Latin American, or Native American blood in the room, at least from what he could tell. The bar was not full, which made his entrance even more noticeable. Nearly everyone in the room stopped talking and looked at him as he came in. Most of those in the bar were men. Let me just stop for a second. David Gomes is brown-skinned, clearly black. Right? "Are you in the right place, my friend?" came a voice with a slight Irish accent to Gomes' left. Gomes turned and saw a man wearing an apron, picking up some glasses and moving toward the counter. "Yeah, thanks, I'm here to meet somebody." Slight murmurs around the bar. A man sitting to Gomes' right, ignoring the whole thing, reading a book, smoking a cigarette, and drinking a beer. A couple of the women who first noticed him returned to their discussion. Another woman smiled at Gomes fondly, but said nothing. "You're probably in the wrong place, lad," said another man who appeared out of nowhere. He was built like a wrestler, probably in his 30s, dressed in a blue work shirt, stitched onto it the letters of a company, QPR. "We don't get many of your kind in this establishment. We're very particular, you know. No offense intended." "No offense taken. I was told to meet someone here, so since he appears not to be here at the moment, how about you leave me alone and let me get a beer and relax, okay? I'll just wait for him to show up." "I think that the owner of this here establishment believes that it's unlikely you would be meeting someone here, lad. And I think that you'd be all happy if you just moved on. You get my meaning there, lad. Gomes concluded that he was going to have to rethink spending time in Quincy. The busing crisis showed that Malcolm X was absolutely correct. The problem in the U.S. was not the South. The South, Malcolm said, was anything south of the Canadian border. Why do these white Quincy folks keep fucking with me, he asked himself. Gomes looked at his watch. I got your meaning, he said, walking over to a table near the window behind the man reading the book. Mr. QPR pursued him to his table. You don't seem to understand, lad, he said again, this time putting his hand out to grab Gomes by the left shoulder. Bad move. The next thing that Mr. QPR knew, he was being held with his arm behind him and Gomes' other arm pressing against his larynx. Gomes whispered into Mr. QPR's ear, I want to be left alone. I'm not interested in dating your sister or daughter. I'm not interested in moving next door to your racist ass. Just leave me the fuck alone. Got it, lad? Gomes pushed the man away, the latter shaking his arm and rubbing his throat. He looked over at a couple of other men in the room who rose in sync, the three of them approaching Gomes. As Mr. QPR approached, the man who had been reading the book took his right hand and grabbed the fellow in the crotch. QPR screamed. The other two men immediately stopped advancing. I think that the gentleman behind me asked to be left alone. Did I hear him right, buddy? The man said with an Irish brogue. Yeah, responded Mr. QPR in obvious agony, standing on his toes, paralyzed, looking as if he was going to burst. So let's get this straight. The three of you are going to leave this gentleman alone. You know, I regularly visit this establishment, and I think you really don't want to piss me off. Am I right about that, my friend? The bartender signaled to everyone that they calm down. He yelled out, look, I think we had a misunderstanding, no harm. The man released QPR's crotch, and the victim limped away toward the restroom, looking over his shoulder at Gomes. The Good Samaritan then turned to Gomes. Good afternoon, Mr. Gomes. My name is Eddie O'Hare. Sorry about the difficulties. Difficulties? Gomes responded incredulously. You were just going to sit there while I got my ass kicked? Once Gomes joined O'Hare at the table, the two men continued their discussion. But you didn't. Besides, I had to see what sort of person you are. People are interesting, Mr. Gomes, and you need to see them under pressure. I saw you under pressure, and to be honest, I'm impressed. Before Gomes could respond, O'Hare went on, from what I'm told, you want information that could put me in serious danger. I need to know whether it's worth my taking risks. He took a sip of his beer and licked his lips. Gomes finally smiled, nodding his head affirmatively. He took a look at O'Hare. The man was probably in his late 30s, a tad over 6 feet, with short dark hair and dark eyes that, along with his eyebrows, presented a look of melancholy. He was thin without being skinny, black eyeglasses, and appeared to have not shaved for a couple of days. He was wearing shipyard coveralls with several burns in the cloth. His face was quite clean. Can I order you a drink, O'Hare asked, extending his hand to shake. I suppose I'll do that, having scared the shit out of you, he said, chuckling. Thanks, Mr. O'Hare, but the drinks are on me. I appreciate your time, returning the shake. That was one of several parts of the book that I had great joy writing. Right?
I can tell.
Yes, I did. Living in Boston in the Boston area between 1972 and 1990 was very difficult, and particularly between 1972 and 1983. We were living through a civil war. So when people talk about the U.S. is in a cold civil war, it is, but I know what that's like because that's what Boston was. Mm-hmm. And there were entire areas in Boston and outside of Boston you did not go if you were black. There's an earlier scene in this where he is stopped by this cop, Gomes is. And it's that kind of thing that you just lived with. Mm-hmm. And I wanted the readers to get some sense of that. Those of us that lived in Boston and worked in the shipyard would drive down Quincy Shore Drive to get to the shipyard, and we would drive fast. We did not, if we were black, we did not stop. you know, even in the summer to, you know, there were certain restaurants you knew you could go to and others that you just stayed away from. So I decided to summarize it here.
Thank you.
Sure.
So I want to use that as a segue to, first of all, to thank a mutual friend of ours named Tim Sheard, who started Hardball Press, that dared to publish a first novel by a labor activist agitator, and has published lots of other great stuff. And when Tim started his project, part of it was publishing his own writing, having been an emergency room nurse, and also writing murder mysteries, in which, in his case, the shop steward from the nurses' union solved the crime. But I'm wondering, I suspect that Tim is watching us tonight virtually, and I hope that he's thinking about going into audiobooks. And we probably all have a sense whether we prefer an audiobook that's read by the author or read by, say, a professional actor. And I vote for this guy to read to read his own books. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I appreciate that, Peter.
Well, thank you.
I mean, it's interesting because Tim and I have talked about this a lot. Everywhere I go, people say, well, it needs to be an audiobook. And I've conveyed that to Tim. But I want to thank Tim. I want to thank him, and I also want to thank Danny Glover, who I dedicate this book to. And there's a couple of stories there that I want to tell you all. But I want to first thank Tim. When I wrote The Man Who Fell from the Sky, I went to look for an agent. Now, for nonfiction, I didn't have an agent and didn't need one. But with fiction, you basically need an agent. And I went looking for an agent, and I could not find, I kept getting turned down. The most remarkable example was where an agent said to me in an email, I liked your manuscript. I would have introduced the characters differently than you did, and therefore I will not represent you. And I read that like 3 times, and I'm saying, what? You liked it, you have editing, and you're not gonna... And I was despairing until I ran into Tim. And Tim, we were at a meeting, and he asked me what I was doing, and I told him, and he said, well, like, send me a chapter or 2 and a synopsis. I did. Then he sent me an email, said, send me the rest of it. I did. And then he said, well, when you're in New York next time, we should meet. And so we met at a Starbucks, and we sat down, and he pulled out a contract. He said, this is a very good first draft. And the words were really important to me because, one, he liked the basic idea. The second, he was telling me from the giddy up, you're going to have to work on this. And a lot of people don't want to do the work that's involved in writing, and whether it's fiction or nonfiction. And we went through in the first book, I think we went through maybe 10 drafts. With this, we went through fewer because I became a better writer. And I became a better writer largely because of Tim. I mean, he gave me incredible feedback. I deferred to him on almost everything, except a few things where I just said no, right? But the first bit was, I gave it to 5 people, my wife and daughter, and 3 other people, and I said, give me a thumbs up or thumbs down. If it's a thumbs up, I'll pursue it. A thumbs down, I'll just leave it. But I enjoyed it, so don't worry about it. They all gave me a thumbs up, and that's when I went forward. But I thanked Danny. I met Danny Glover on a delegation to Cuba in 1999. And we just hit it off. And Danny was not a demigod. He was not a saint. He was and is a wonderful guy, just a regular human being, very approachable. And we were talking about things that he was working on, and I told him about a story, not one of these that got published, that I had, and he said, why don't you write a treatment and send it to me, and we'll consider maybe turning it into a film. And, my response was, oh, yeah, sure. And I basically took it as, it's like a throwaway line. And so I got back home, and a few months later, I was talking to a friend of mine, and I told her about this, and she said, you idiot. Danny Glover said, write a treatment and send it, and you're sitting around? So I said, okay. So the first thing I got to figure out is, what is a treatment, right? And then when I found out what that was, I wrote a treatment, sent it, but nothing ever happened. And I don't fault him for that. So, but that said to me, maybe there's something here. So then I wrote a manuscript in 2008 for this first story that didn't get published. And I took it to an agent who I'd been introduced to. And I asked her whether she would read it. She said, sure. She had been encouraging me to write nonfiction, but she said, sure. So a few weeks later, she got back to me, and she did not like the manuscript at all. She ridiculed the manuscript, and her final words to me were, when you return to writing nonfiction, call me. Yeah, that's right. And it's like, I said, whoa. If I hadn't enjoyed writing the manuscript, I would have been crushed. And it reminds you, particularly those of you that teach, how important your words are when you're dealing with students or mentees, that you can say something very lightly that just crushes somebody, and that's it. They're gone. They'll never, and so you've got to really think about it. But I, fortunately, wasn't crushed, but I didn't write anything more for a few more years until I came up with this other story, which was The Man Who Fell from the Sky. And so Danny was and remained incredibly supportive. The other person who was very influential was Walter Mosley, who I also met. He was on my board at Trans-Africa. And I saw through his writings, I just was very inspired by Walter and the way he introduced politics. In fact, he did a science fiction thing at some point. And I was a co-founder of a group called the Black Radical Congress. And Walter figured out a way of working in the Black Radical Congress into this science fiction piece. And it was like, it wasn't the Black Radical Congress we formed, but it was like the second, and he said, the second Black Radical Congress, and the third. And it was, and I called him and I just thanked him. And he says, I was worried that people were going to be upset. I said, man, I'm honored, you know. And Walter's a great guy.
Great. Let me ask Bailey and Kirsten, are people online sending in questions? Can we have a, go ahead, please. And we want to use the microphone so people at home can hear us. Yes.
Are you related to Ben Fletcher, the IWW organizer?
Only ideologically. But no, I've been asked.
Who was also in Boston.
No, he was in Philadelphia.
Oh, Philadelphia.
Philadelphia. And I'm always asked that question. And I looked into his family. From what we can tell, no. My family, the Fletchers came from the Washington, D.C. area somehow. And then my grandfather left Washington, D.C. with my grandmother and then moved to West Virginia and then ultimately to Reading, Pennsylvania. I don't know anything about his family. But he was quite a character. Yeah.
Yes.
That's a great book.
Yeah, and we've had Peter Cole, the author of that book, has been here.
Yeah.
Yes. So we know if you keep getting asked that question,
Oh,
it
yeah.
tells us what circles you're traveling in.
Absolutely.
Yes. Yes. Mike, please. Wait for the microphone. Yes.
I like what you said about the contamination and you go into hierarchy and same experience
It's a great question.
With the lights getting turned on and, oh, I gotta write about that.
Yeah.
I gotta write about that.
That's a great question. Let me tell you how I write fiction. I film the story in my head. And I mean, almost literally, it's like I dream up the story and I see it as if it was a film. And then what I do is I start making notes. And not comprehensive. Like I remember Robert Ludlum was interviewed once, and he said that he would write these really detailed outlines, and then after he finished it, he'd throw out the outline and just write the book. I don't do detailed, I make notes. But then what happens, and writers talk about this, but it's really true. You're writing, and all of a sudden, your fingers start doing things that you hadn't planned. And it's like you're going in certain directions that you actually hadn't been thinking about. And you got to keep going, because you can always edit it out later. But when you have that impulse, you got to do it. And it happens, it's true. And it's fun, it's almost scary. You almost feel like you're channeling somebody. And then it's like, wow, where did that come from? And then you can go back and edit it, because you might decide it was fun, but it doesn't really fit in. So I didn't know always, like, with this book, we changed the ending. It's not giving away. The very first part, what's the preface, was going to be at the end. And it was Tim's suggestion that we reverse that, and I think it was right. The one area where Tim and I disagreed, there were two areas. One is that, in part because I'm influenced by film noir, I like the idea of my characters being complicated. They're not saints. And in my original David Gomes, in the first book and the second, I made him a little bit more complicated than Tim was comfortable with. So I deferred to Tim. But Tim wanted David Gomes to be more like a detective. And that's where I drew the line. And I said, Tim, David Gomes is not Jim Rockford, and he's not Easy Rollins. He is, I said, he is this black guy in a small part of a small state for a small paper who is, in both books, confronted with some major challenges, life-threatening. And I said, the way I want you to think about it is this way. Let's imagine that tomorrow you found out that the Gambino crime family had put a hit out on you. What would you do? I said, that's what I want the reader to appreciate, that you wouldn't act like Jim Rockford. You wouldn't know what the hell to do, right? I mean, let's just be real, right? And, you'd be scared, right? And you'd like, well, do I get out of town? And where do I go? Do I go to my uncle's house in White Plains? Or do I go somewhere I've never been? I mean, there's all these questions that Jim Rockford and Easy Rollins wouldn't have, but David Gomes does. And so that was where we had a difference, and it just turned out I was right.
Do you want to bring the microphone up here, and so the folks at home can hear Walter's question? Yes.
Thank you for the great presentation of the text. And
Thank you.
a little complicated premise, but I love the piece about Cape Verde and the way you've welcomed that for both books.
Thank you.
Into that history. I'm just coming from Ireland, where I was astonished at the level of struggle against empire that's
Yes.
embedded there, and the way it's infused their sense of labor union as movement, and the history that lives in so much of the places that they create. The country just kind of resonates with it. I feel like that's what you're doing with the books, is helping us reimagine what we're seeing
Yes.
in a place like New York or Boston. And the tension in your second piece was what really brought this forward, was this Irish bar and
Yeah.
this Cape Verdean guy, and trying to figure out the tensions that are so far from kind of the larger culture and how those things get worked out. So the question I have is, as we sit here in St. Paul and Minneapolis and doing this in this place, which is doing some of the same work, like, do you have advice or guidance to us as we take on our own process to try and live that history and really bring those stories forward into the future?
There's so much in what you just said, and I'm trying to figure out where to start. So I'm going to actually start in Ireland. So the guy, Eddie O'Hare, is an Irish immigrant, but he was a former soldier in the Irish National Liberation Army, which was the military wing of the Irish Republican Socialist Party. It was a smaller group to the Provost, the IRA. And so part of what I wanted to do was introduce a little Irish history. And this guy is a leftist, and he has a different kind of consciousness. He's he's a composite, but to some extent inspired by somebody I worked with at the shipyard, who was an Irish immigrant, and who may very well have been a soldier, but you don't ask those questions, right? But he wasn't a racist. And I was used to meeting all these Irish people that treated me like dogs, right? And this guy didn't. He treated me like a human being. And I thought, okay, this is interesting. I knew a little bit about Ireland. When I went to Ireland, I went to Northern Ireland in 1988. And that's where it was like so obvious, because I was in Northern Ireland. There was no one else that was black or anything else that I could tell. All these white people. And when I was in the Catholic sections of Northern Ireland, I could have been in Harlem, at least the old Harlem, before it started gentrifying. I could have been in Roxbury before it started gentrifying, right? And it was amazing. And so I was giving a speech in Belfast, and this guy stands up. And, you know, I'm living in Boston at the time, and this guy stands up, and he could have been someone out of Southie, you know, South Boston. And he stands up and he says, Bill, he says, I don't understand. You look around, you see what we're going through here in Ireland, the way the Brits treat us. How is it that Irish can go to the United States and then treat black people the way we're treated here? So I smiled. This was a question I could have paid this guy money, because I wanted that question. And I said, well, this is what you got to understand. When Irish leave and they get on the planes in Belfast or Dublin, they take off and they're flying across the Atlantic. They go through this cloud. And then when the plane lands at Logan Airport or Kennedy or Philly, they get off as white people. And the guy looked at me, smiled, and had no further questions, right? And see, in Ireland, you understand race, and you understand that race was not first premised on skin color. The Irish, indigenous Irish, were treated by the Brits, and to this day, I would argue, as an inferior race, and they used that term. And they brought settlers from Scotland, Wales, and England there, and identified them as superior, as a superior race. And they repeatedly did that. So I'm starting there to say that one of the things is that people got to understand history, which is exactly why DeSantis, Trump, and all these other characters are trying to suppress it. Because when you actually start studying history, and particularly when you're studying race, you start to understand this notion of social control. See, DeSantis isn't really concerned about what black people learn about our own history, because we're gonna figure it out, right? They're concerned about what you white people are gonna find out. And not just at the level of morality, it's like, oh my God, there was slavery and stuff like that. No, but they don't want white people to figure out that for the first 100 years of the British settlement, the term white wasn't used. They don't want white people to understand why indentured servitude for Africans was ended and racial slavery was instituted, right? They don't want folks to understand the one-drop rule. They don't want to understand, they want people to hear stories like this. In 1741, there was an uprising being planned in the New York colony, and it was Irish and Africans. And as often happened, there was a turncoat that gave away the story, and everyone got caught. And before they were executed, they were interrogated. And this professor told me the story, and it was really fascinating. And he said, when they interrogated the Africans, they said, what was the objective of the uprising? And the Africans said, to kill all the white people. And there's no surprise there, right? And then they asked the Irish, so what was your intent in this uprising? And the Irish said, to kill all the white people, right? And it was like, wow, wait a minute now. See, DeSantis and others, they don't want people to understand, wait a minute, wait a damn minute. These Irish are saying to kill. So obviously, white people wasn't the way they saw themselves. So it was a political designation. This is what people got to get. And a lot of folks don't really appreciate that. And that's part of the living of history. We're living it. And we've got to propagate it. We've got to be the communicators of history. We've got to be talking with people about the significance of this. This is not abstract stuff. This is about understanding the mechanisms that the larger system used. I'll give you an example from Venezuela, and in terms of race. So I was there in 2004. I led a delegation, it's the first African-American delegation to go. We met with, President Chavez and others. It was a fascinating visit. And we met with the opposition. And so, at least me and someone else did. And so the opposition was saying to us, you North Americans, you stir things up. We don't have any racial problem in Venezuela. You come here and you talk all this about race. And Chavez, by the way, had been talking about race. And so they were blaming North Americans for stirring up Chavez. And I said, that's interesting. I said, so I want you to explain something to me. So I look at Venezuela, and at the bottom, it's pretty dark. And then the higher up it goes, it gets lighter. Is that like a genetic issue? The meeting ended shortly after that comment, right? And that's what I mean of living it, right? I mean, we've got to challenge people, and we've got to be talking about the way the system operates. And so it's not just about pride in our history as people of African descent, which of course we have to have, but it's also understanding the system, and in different ways through fiction. I mean, I do these talks about nonfiction all the time, but I thought, let's play with fiction and introduce it so that people will walk away and say, maybe I should study something about Cape Verdeans.
Great. Jim Stewart, here, have a microphone.
Thank you. So fascinated by so many different things that you've been putting together here, because one of my real preoccupations for the past 20 years is try to get over the barrier between academic knowledge and public understanding of the kinds of things you're talking about. Mm-hmm. And what I'm concerned about is the half-life of most of the things we try.
Yeah.
For example, the best documentary I think I've ever seen about anything in American history is Skip Gates's 4 parts on Reconstruction. That's got a half-life of about 1.5 years. Also thinking about the whole question of teaching, because teaching has become so involved with performance that it has less and less to do with, what would you call it? You don't want to call it outcomes, you want to call it actions.
Yeah.
And so as Peter and I are going back and forth about this kind of stuff all the time, I've tried YouTube videos teaching American history through African American art, a whole bunch of different things like that. But the one thing that you have that I don't have and don't understand is how you make this transition back and forth between imagination and the novel side of things and the historian and political analyst that you really are. I can't do that. And the reason I can't do that is because I'm really good at the one thing. And when I try to move over to the other side, it all becomes a matter of styling rather than a question of reconceiving the whole form. And I don't know where I'm going with all this, except I'm fascinated by the way that you do it, and I'd like to have you explain to me how you drive on both sides of the road.
Thank you. So I'm going to give you 2 answers to that. I'm not sure that I've succeeded in going on both sides of the road. Writing, yes, but being accepted, no. I think that Tim, my publisher, told me the story of going to, I think, the Labor Notes conference last year, and he had set up a book table, and he had The Man Who Fell from the Sky on it, among other books. And he said, people would come up, and they'd say, I know Bill Fletcher, I've read his stuff. And then they wouldn't buy a book. And I think that's about the lane issue. What's that?
A pseudonym.
Well, if I had a major publisher and could get away with it, yeah. But if I put some pseudonym, that's not going to sell. But you're right. But that's part of the problem. It's like, will someone give it a chance, right? So that's one answer. But hold on a second. The other thing, though, is that because I grew up reading and watching a lot of fiction, I've integrated fiction into the way I talk. So when I'm giving speeches, I often make reference to movies, television shows. Like, for example, I'm a Star Trek fanatic. Absolute. And I integrate that. I integrate mysteries into something, to make a point. And what I find is that resonates with people. First of all, for many people, it makes me more human. Bill Fletcher is into Star Trek. I can't tell you how many times people said, Bill Fletcher, you're into science fiction? You're into Star Trek? You identify with the Klingon Empire? I mean, stuff like that, right? And it changes the relationship. So one thing I encourage people to do is to try to figure out ways of integrating contemporary fiction into nonfiction, right? Use of metaphor becomes really important. So I've done that, and it's worked. But I don't know, so I have a third David Gomes novel that's being filmed up here. And it is almost completed, I think. I've changed some things. But what I'm trying to decide is whether to write it, because it's really hard, and that's why I appreciate events like this. It's really hard because my publisher can't afford to put me on the road. And it just, that's not a criticism, he just can't do it.
Right.
And so I have to take the book where I'm going. I have to arrange events. It's very hard getting reviews because there's a form of payola that seems to exist when it comes to reviews. And so I'm not sure whether I'm going to write another David Gomes novel. I haven't decided yet. Now, if the first one gets turned into a film or limited series, then I will, because there's a good chance, as with what's his name who wrote The Firm, right? His first book, a time to die, or something,
Yeah.
right? Time to Kill, was not a hit when it first came out. But after The Firm, all of a sudden, the book was reissued and everyone's buying it, right? So if the Man Who Fell from the Sky gets turned into something, that might be the encouragement I need. Or I might just write it and not, I don't know. I'm playing with it.
Great.
Sure.
Great. Other questions out here? Mohammed, please. And the microphone, yes.
Yeah, thank you for that wonderful presentation. I just have a few questions for you. So the first one just goes back to the what you mentioned about like Verdeans shying away from their identity or their identification with being Cape Verdean. Mm-hmm. And is it mainly like among just the diaspora communities, or is it also in the mainland? And was wondering about like the legacy of Amilcar Cabral, and if there's any remnants of his legacy for the like young people, and like ideas of, because part of it was also culture, like ideas like return to the source. It was also about like forging a new culture and a new identity. So I was wondering if that still has some sort of presence for younger people. A couple of questions also. It's mainly about like influences.
All right, hold on a second.
Yeah.
So first, assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum salam.
And the second is, let's go one question at a time, because I'm not going to remember all these.
Okay.
So let's just, because I'm fine with my time. So what's the first, tell me the first one again.
It's mainly about like the presence of, or like the legacy of
The
Cabral and like the decolonial struggle, because what you mentioned in your work is trying to go to the idea of like injustice and revenge, and like into it goes also like colonialism, decolonization,
Right.
and maybe also even the failure of the post-colonial project. So those like how it gets intertwined and how it influences your work, but also how is it being played in the actual like real world, and how is it affecting like younger people in the current time regarding how they identify. Because there is some sort of a resurgence of like Pan-African ideas in Africa in general.
Right.
But it's still like people know or like hear the name Cabral, but they don't know much about his work or what he wrote. So I was wondering for Cape Verdean, with him being a Cape Verdean, a leader of the decolonization movement, how is his legacy affecting or influencing current generations?
So, Cape Verde, the consciousness among Cape Verdeans really did change in the 70s, in part because of the struggle for liberation from Portugal, as well as because of the Black Power movement in the United States. So that converged, and so this consciousness really starts to change. And so there were people I knew, older generation, but they identified as Portuguese, but then started to identify dead up Black and Cape Verdean, right? Cabral remains a very important figure for Cape Verdean Americans. And Amilcar Cabral was himself Cape Verdean, and a brilliant, brilliant theorist. And there are regular celebrations among Cape Verdeans in the United States that uphold Cabral. And that remains very, very important. How much people study Cabral, I don't know. But Cabral remains a very important figure. Now, the other thing about Cabral is about what happens to Guinea-Bissau. So the Portuguese controlled Guinea-Bissau and Cape Verde, and when the War of Independence starts, it's led by the PAIGC, the African Party for the Independence of Guinea-Bissau and the Cape Verde Islands. And so in 1975, the independence is granted to both Guinea-Bissau and Cape Verde as one country. Okay, now, point one. Cabral was assassinated in January or February of 1973. Now, many of us that were on the left at the time automatically said he was killed by Portuguese agents. Well, yes and no. As it turns out, there was a factional fight within the PAIGC that the Portuguese played into. But it wasn't simply like that the Portuguese sent in black agents to carry it out. There were contradictions, and some of those contradictions had to do with Cape Verde, Guinea-Bissau. So he's assassinated, and then Guinea-Bissau and Cape Verde become independent. And Luis Cabral, his brother, becomes the president. In 1980, he's overthrown in a coup. And Guinea-Bissau and Cape Verde split at that point. And part of that was this underlying resentment that was going on about the Cape Verdeans and the role that they were playing. And I'm not justifying it, don't get me wrong. But there were people in Bissau that were resentful of the strong Cape Verdean presence. So they separated. And Guinea-Bissau has degenerated into kind of a narco state, which would, Cabral is probably doing somersaults, right, in terms of what has happened, because the level of sophistication of the PIGC, no one would have anticipated that to have happened. But in the United States, much more consciousness about Cabral. And, I don't know Cape Verdeans that would identify as white at this point, unless they really are passing. But it's not the same that it once was. What's your next question?
Thank you. So it's actually two questions, and it's mainly regarding influences that have influenced your work, because you mentioned fiction as being a major influence, and film also. So looking into fiction, I was wondering if like post-colonial literature or African American also literature that goes in the same line, like Richard Wright, for example, Native Son and The Outsider, or for example, even Tayyip Saleh, Season of Migration to the North. It goes in the same line of crime fiction to some degree. So I was wondering if they had any influence on you, and was also wondering about film, because you mentioned film noir as being an influence. So I was also wondering if third cinema had any influence in your work and your conception of what you write. You got me fiction-wise.
Well, it's a very hard question to answer, because there's multiple influences, and you have to be careful when you give credit, because some people will say, well, why didn't I get credit also? And it's so that's why I say film noir and Walter Mosley in particular. I'm also influenced by I've gotten into on Netflix watching a lot of European, particularly Scandinavian, crime stories, which I find really fascinating, and that play up dialogue. They're very intelligent. They're not like just shoot 'em ups. Some in France. I'm watching something now called Ganglands, which is really amazing. So I draw from various sources. My political influences range from Mao to Fanon to Malcolm X, Cabral, Lenin. There's a whole assortment of influences, and like I said, I haven't turned away from nonfiction. I wrote a long piece that was published by Monthly Review a couple of years ago called The Modern Tecumseh, which is about socialist strategy. And It's inspired by Antonio Gramsci and his notion of the modern prince. And in some ways, what I try to do with that book is use a story, the story of Tecumseh, in order to make certain points about strategy. So it's not fiction, but it's different.
Thank you.
So I want to stop this part of the program so that you have the opportunity to purchase books from our sister from Subtext Books in the back. And I suspect that the author is willing to sign
Absolutely.
books,
Yeah.
right? So that you know how the value shoots up, that becomes a collectible. And it's also an opportunity for some more informal chit-chat. So please join me in thanking Bill Fletcher Jr.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much.
And thank you all for coming. Great.
Thank you.